when I quit my 9 to 5, the first thing that I felt wasn't actually like a feeling of freedom. It was relief, like deep relief. And I think that that feeling of relief came from me knowing that from that point forward, I no longer had to care about performing well in many different ways for a job that I was not aligned with, you know. And that's what I want to talk about in today's video. The things that I stopped caring about, once I quit my job. So let's get into it. So, some of the, I guess, more obvious things that I stopped caring about was, a dress code, right? I'm currently on a career break right now, and I'm not planning on going back to work in the immediate future. I'm going to eventually go back, but I'm prioritizing rest and recovering from burnout currently, and that's just what I'm doing right now. So whenever work comes back around, it comes back around, right? But back to the dress code thing. So that's one of the obvious things, right? Because now I'm not working. I don't have to, come to work in, business casual, just to sit at a desk all day, you know, and worry about my physical appearance and making sure that it I'm maintaining a professional, appearance just to appease and make other people feel comfortable, right? So that's probably the most obvious thing that I stopped caring about, but it's important because to me, it's a level of performance, right? You're not necessarily, I mean, you could be comfortable dressing business casual, right? But I think depending on the context of your job, you might feel like it's just not necessary. It's not necessary, you know what I mean? Depending on the type of work that you do, right? I'm not saying that you are coming into work with pajamas, but at least just regular casual wear, right? Still maintaining your appearance, just being presentable, but not, you know, um, in a way that, is unflattering, right? And when I say unflattering, I'm not, you know what I mean. Um, so the dress code, right? Another more obvious thing I think that a lot of us deal with, especially when we're, meeting new people, networking, that sort of thing, or even when we're talking to friends and family or catching up after a while. And that is caring about, your job title, your status, right? And what you do for a living. I don't care about that. And, leading with that is what I'm saying. Like, I don't care about making sure I'm doing, whatever work that I'm doing, it sounds successful, right? I don't care about doing that anymore. Because when I come off of my career break, what I'm going to focus on is doing work that I value and that aligns with, what I want to do in life to be able to sustain it, because I no longer want to experience burnout again. This is my second time throughout my career kind of hitting a wall with my work. And I've decided, you know what, something has to change. And it's not just about the job itself, it's about the work that I do, the career path that I'm on, right? So me revamping that, kind of hashing out the details of what I want my life to look like moving forward, you know, and that not being centered around what people's ideal of success should, look and sound like when it comes to what do you do for a living. So I no longer care about that, right? climbing the corporate ladder. And just to give you some context, so my career is in IT, so I'm a techie, right? But I worked. It's very important that we put that on present or past tense because no more, right? But I worked in GovTech, which is, IT for government, for the government, right? And climbing the corporate ladder in that sense is wasn't really more so about really getting promotions per se. It was just really more so about moving to that next best job, right? And it didn't necessarily mean within the same, career path that I was on, right? Just kind of make getting to the next level, right? Whether you classify that as a promotion, yeah, I guess you could classify it as being promoted, but for me, more like, chasing a higher salary, quite honestly, which kind of ties into the next thing that I no longer care about, which is chasing a big salary. I've made it to the six-figure mark. Um, I got there. It was fine until it wasn't fine anymore, and now I find myself on a career break. So, kind of tying back into the corporate ladder for me more so, it was working in tech, it was always kind of going after that next highest certification, right? To make sure that I kept myself marketable, right? For when the next time came around that I wanted to go after that, next big job, right? And so I no longer care about doing any of that. I'm not leaving tech because I enjoy tech. I love computers, and working in tech is kind of one of those careers where it requires you to be a lifelong learner. And honestly, I love learning new things. I love kind of just keeping my brain active, and just it's just one of my hobbies. It's some stuff that I do when I'm bored. Honestly, I'll just find something to learn, right? Especially with tech. I love tech and stuff like that. So I am I am cool with working in tech, but you know the industry and what it is exactly I want to do is definitely going to be change or is going to change for me. I've spent years kind of following a path that was pretty much laid out. It was laid out in front of me, like going to the next logical step, right? Just kind of on autopilot, just kind of coming through, even though throughout this time I'm always feeling like I really don't, this isn't really what I want to be doing, but I might as well just go ahead and do it because, you know, based on my resume, and the experience that I have, this makes sense. It makes sense to do this next thing, right? And plus we have to be employed, right? We have to, make a living for ourselves. And I just found myself going through the years, just doing what made sense based off of, that piece of paper or resume, right? So, just climbing the corporate ladder is just something I no longer care about. I'm just trying to I'm rebuilding, honestly, guys. I'm rebuilding to center the work around me, honestly, and my skill sets, and the value that I bring, not so much as me trying to mold myself to conform to what this job wants, if that makes sense. So instead of the job being the center and me figuring out how to make myself fit into that job, I'm the center, right? And now I'm looking for the jobs that fit me, right? So climbing the corporate ladder is just not, and that's doesn't jive well with that way of doing things, right? So next thing, this is a big one. kind of ties into what I was just talking about, which is LinkedIn validation. Let me tell you, over the years, LinkedIn is one of those platforms where you may have like a love-hate relationship with it, depending on if you utilize it, how well you utilize it, right? If it, works for you or not, right? But especially when you work in tech, and I mean, I can only speak from that experience point of view, because that was my career. That's been my career for the last 8 years. I've just worked in tech, and just making sure that your LinkedIn is just updated and making sure that it looks like you really love what you do all the time, and making sure that you're staying active um, on the platform, and really about look at me, look what I just did, look what I just achieved. And I think a lot of that, honestly, it kind of ties into why I always kind of felt like I always had to be getting the next thing, right? Because these recruiters and employers and people need to see that I am actively doing things throughout my career, that I'm not just complacent, right? And I'm not just stagnant. I'm not, you know, not applying myself to learn new things, right? And I think LinkedIn is a big part, maybe subconsciously on that played into the overachieving side of me, as a high performer. Um, and guess what? I don't care about LinkedIn anymore. um, because not in that respect, right? Not from a look at me, look what I done, look what I've done, look at how active I'm, being, because of how I'm going to be switching the dynamic of, my career around. When I do start back working, I'm going to approach LinkedIn again as here's the value I bring, to the table. This is who I am. This is what I do. This is how I can help you, right? Instead of, hey, look, I'm doing all of this stuff. I'm marketable. I'm really, pick me. I always kind of felt like LinkedIn was like a pick me for your next for your next great dream job kind of environment. You know what I mean? And I've had, I don't know if I would say some success with LinkedIn. So this isn't really about knocking LinkedIn, because I know that LinkedIn can be an amazing tool, for professionals, you know what I mean? Or for professionals, entrepreneur, I just know that it can be an amazing tool. So I'm not bashing LinkedIn. It's just in relationship to the things, how I perceived it, as far as how it connects to, my career experience. It's just, that's what I'm speaking on, right? It's not about knocking the platform or anything like that. Because like I said, I know it can be extremely resourceful, a great tool for your career. So in any event, LinkedIn validation, no longer care about that, right? Um, because I'm definitely pivoting. I'm pivoting my career um, in a different direction completely. And when I do, I'll look at LinkedIn more as a tool um, to bring, to bring employment to me, as opposed to me going out and seeking employment, if that makes sense. Kind of like what I was talking about earlier, with changing the dynamic, right? Instead of me changing myself to fit a job, now it's me looking for jobs that fit me, right? So, and that's how I'm going to use LinkedIn, right? So just giving a bit of insight on how I plan on pivoting, when the time comes, right? All right, so some of the more, so not some of the less obvious things that you don't really see that are kind of things that are just in your mind, And I'm a recovering perfectionist, especially when it comes to my work, and what I do, especially, um, but just in general, just always feeling like, it has to be done right, or I'm not going to bother with it at all, right? Um, Something that, just the perfection, which I'll get to that in a second. I'm kind of jumping ahead, but I was talking about perfectionism because something that I no longer care about, is having all the answers, right? Especially in tech, especially when you find yourself being like one of the more seasoned employees, like you've been around a little bit longer. You're kind of expected to know more, and if you don't know, you should know, where to get the answer, right? At least that's what my experience has been, and just kind of always carrying the weight of being being a resource for having the answers, right? No longer care about, you know feeling like I have to have that, responsibility, or take on that responsibility of, making sure I know, have all the answers and I can do all the things, right? Again, coming from a high performer, overachiever, going above and beyond, I have to prove my worth, you know perspective, right? So that's something that, not so obvious, but definitely is something now that I'm just learning to let go. Hey, I don't feel like I have to have the answers. And it's not like a know-it-all. I'm not talking about as a know-it-all, because I'm definitely not a know-it-all. But when I don't know things, I was always able to find it out, you know what I mean? Or figure out where to get the answer from, right? So again, just dealing with that whole kind of, high performing, overachieving, perfectionism, all of that bundled up, right? And we tend to, and that's why we tend to run into burnout, right? Because we're constantly performing, putting, just constantly going, right? So yeah. So no longer hearing about having all the answers. That's a really big one. I already touched on chasing a higher salary. I think, but just coming back around to it, you always, because what we're taught, in society is, the goal is you have to be making six figures. That is the ideal middle class family, household salary, six figures, whether it's low, high, mid, six figures, right? So you're constantly, you're hustling, right? You're hustling to constantly keep moving up, and eventually you get, to that six figure salary. And, for some people it's amazing. It's completely life changing and their life is better. For some people, they get to the six figure salary and they're completely stressed out all the time, so their quality of life, suffers. And for others, those of us who are kind of in the middle, where you hit six figures and you're not particularly happy with your life, you're not sad either, you just like, okay, this is it. I'm still kind of dealing with all of the same stuff that I've been dealing with, even though I make more money, right? Um, and that's like the boat that I fall in, and just thinking back to how hard, and I had to work to get to that point, and just getting there and being like, okay, is this it? Not saying that not from an ungrateful perspective, but you just expect that once you hit a certain level, that everything is supposed to change for the better, right? Because that's what we're sold. That's the dream we're sold, right? Um, and then when you get there and realize, nope, that's not necessarily true. And again, I'm not speaking for everybody. Those of us who, you know, got there and we're just like, oh, wow, okay. Nothing's really changed. I don't really feel any different, you know. I don't really feel anything at all, you know. Dang, I got this far and you know what, I don't really think I really want to do this anymore, you know. It's real. It is real. It is real. So, chasing higher salary. I no longer care about doing that. Um, Now I'm just focused more on my quality of life, regardless of, you know, what the salary that comes with it, you know, may be. And just learning, you know, that's one of the things that I talk about, that I especially will be talking about going into the future is, you know, personal finance, um, financial independence, learning personal finance, skill sets, and things that you can do that will set you up, you know, for financial freedom, regardless of the salary that you're on. I'm a really big proponent of that. Like I really advocate for that, um, because it's important to be able to, you know, live below your means. Not to the point of deprivation, but just understanding that a lot of things that we may classify as needs are really more like wants and comforts, like or luxuries, right? I'm not saying that you shouldn't, have those things, but um, having to, understanding that the dynamic of how having maybe too much of those things can hinder you, you know, financially in other areas or in other ways, right? It's more about that, right? So I'll get off my high horse about that, but look forward to more content talking about that because it's definitely something that I'm extremely passionate about. And the last thing that I have is the big one, society's definition of success, right? Um, that's the biggest one, and that's the biggest takeaway that I wanted to end, my list on, is because, we're told, we have to, go to school, you get your degrees, you get a great job, you get to six figures, you buy the house, you buy the car, you have the family if you choose, um and once you do that, you are successful. Life is grand. You're happy. Everything is great, right? But what happens when you do all of that and you aren't happy, right? Um, so for me, not caring about, society's definition of success, because quite honestly, I've started exploring, not so traditional ways to, make a living. And I mean, or you could say traditional ways, but more so geared towards entrepreneurship, self-employment, um, you know, things that are taking different paths to get to, your goal, of doing work that aligns with you. So right now I'm on a career break. Yes, career breaks they're not unusual. They're pretty common, right? But doing things a bit differently. And I mean, depending on, and honestly, even though career breaks are super common, depending on your, family dynamic or friend, family and friend dynamics, you may, people may not understand it still, you know what I mean? And just approaching it differently, and not let me send out hundreds of resumes and hope to get an interview, because, the job market is not good right now. And the gig economy, I don't know if it's necessarily saturated. I was a part of the gig economy during my first career break that I took a few years ago. And it was fine. But sometimes you see stuff on social media about like it's getting oversaturated and stuff like that. So perhaps it is, but you know, just exploring different ways to earn, to make a living, you know what I mean? That don't fall into that blueprint that we've been sold, our entire lives, especially, as millennials, right? It worked for I'm pretty sure it worked for the boomers and probably Gen X maybe. But, it's definitely, millennials, we were definitely bearing a lot of the load. I think a lot, with things, we're kind of like stuck in the middle, right? So at least that's, from my point of view, I think. But in any event, just wanted to touch on these things. These are the most prevalent things that, you know, I stopped caring about once I quit my job, and just kind of realizing how a lot of that stuff plays into how, I ended up hitting a wall, and paying attention to those things and understanding, you know, how they affect you and figuring out what needs to change and then how to go about changing it, right? So that's a wrap for me. Thank you so much for hanging out with me and watching my video. And let me know in the comments if you were to leave your 9 to 5, what is one thing that you'd stop caring about? Let me know in the comments. Thank you again for watching my video. And until the next one, I will see you then. Take care.